Case Study, in which we revisit cases which feature in psychology textbooks around the world. This week, one hailed for decades as a triumph for medical science, but which has since been revealed to be a tragic failure. In a programme which deals with matters of genital damage and gender reassignment, Claudia Hammond tells the story of the case known as John Joan.
In 1997, on the front page of the New York Times, it was reported that an unnamed patient had emerged in his 30s as someone that had been sex changed as a baby after a botched circumcision, and that this person, who was being referred to as John Joan to reflect the two lives that he'd lived in, that this person was a failed medical experiment, and that in his teens he had converted from the girlhood that had been imposed upon him back to being male. And it was explosive because it had always been reported as a success in the medical literature.
John Colapinto is a journalist. Today he writes for The New Yorker, but in 1997 the John Joan story rang a bell.
My father was the chief of urology at a Toronto hospital. He used to regale us with sometimes horrifying and interesting medical stories at dinner. And I think I was probably about 10 years old when he actually mentioned that in the case of children who lose their penis accidentally during circumcision, they are often, as he put it, turned into girls. And he said there's actually a case here in Canada where this was done. And it stuck in my mind.
It made sense at the time that he became a daughter, because we thought, well, maybe it is a matter of nurture over nature.
I tried to put makeup on, but I looked like Bozo the Clown. It's in you. It's in your genetics. It's in your brain. Nobody has to tell you who you are.
But that's exactly what they tried to tell a boy, known in the medical literature as John, that he was a girl known as Joan. The New York Times article sprang from an academic paper written by a psychologist who'd finally managed to track down the family who, for more than 25 years, had been held up as proof of an influential theory. The theory that it was upbringing, not biology, that determined whether a person feels they're male or female. But the big revelation was that that wasn't what had happened at all with the case at the heart of the theory. Desperately unhappy with life as a girl, Joan had chosen to revert to being John in his early teens. Colapinto was intrigued.
I took a long time to find him. I got friendly with the one psychologist that knew his identity and his location, a man named Dr. Diamond. At the time, I was working for Rolling Stone magazine, and we actually corresponded for 6 months before he gave over the name. And there was a lot to talk about in that 6 months, because I quickly learned that this one isolated and horrifying case actually had implications for the treatment of a lot of different sort of medical genital conditions.
When John Colapinto finally met the subject of the famous case study, the result was a 43-page article, The True Story of John Joan. It was to be another 3 years before the subject agreed to reveal his true identity in the book Colapinto wrote about him. John Joan was in fact David Reimer, a 35-year-old married man who worked in an abattoir.
It was not the sort of place where you comfortably said to your coworkers, hey, I was actually raised as a girl and I've reverted to my original sex. And he told his coworkers actually before the book came out.
And then it's interesting that he did in the end then talk openly about it on TV from having been so reticent at the first place.
I have to say that was amazing to watch. I think one of the empowering things for David was for him to learn that people were not prone to ridicule him or laugh at him or think he was peculiar. They certainly had when he was a child as a girl. So he was used to ridicule and he feared it.
Even David wasn't his original name, just the one he chose when he reverted to being male. On the 22nd of August 1965 in Winnipeg in Canada, Janet Reimer, still a teenager like her husband, gave birth to identical twin boys, Bruce and Brian. The young parents were thrilled and everything went well for the first 7 months. But then, as Janet Reimer told the BBC Horizon programme,
Bruce and Brian both started having trouble urinating. The doctors suggested circumcision.
So on the 27th of April 1966, the Reimers left their baby sons at the hospital to be circumcised. The next morning, there was a phone call.
The penis has been burnt off from circumcision. And I could not comprehend what he was talking about because, you see, I thought they were going to use a knife. I didn't know there was electricity involved.
Using a cauterizing needle instead of a blade, the electrical equipment had malfunctioned and the surging current had completely burnt off Bruce's penis. Brian's operation was cancelled and the Reimers took their twins home.
Daily I was crying. Every time I changed his diaper, I'd cry. I was in shock. I guess about a year I was in shock.
The Reimers had no idea where to turn for help, until one evening when they set eyes on a man who was to change their lives and the lives of their twins forever, Dr. John Money.
We just happened to be watching TV. And Dr. Money was on there, and he was very charismatic. He seemed very highly intelligent and very confident of what he was saying.
John Money was a psychologist specialising in sex changes and had recently helped found the Gender Identity Clinic at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center in Baltimore in the USA. He believed that it wasn't so much biology that determines whether we're male or female, but how we're raised. So it was possible for a baby who was genetically male but had been born with underdeveloped genitals to be raised successfully as a girl. Similarly, a girl born with both male and female sexual organs could be brought up to believe she was male. Such conditions were termed hermaphrodite or later intersex. Today they're called disorders of sex development. Money questioned the gender stereotypes that called for the absolute in femininity or masculinity, and he spoke to the BBC in 1974.
We have a balance of the masculine and the feminine principle in all men and in all women. We can only try by empirical trial and error to discover what are the variations of the feminine pattern of behavior and what are the variations of the masculine pattern that are completely viable and acceptable in themselves, even though they are not part of the historical stereotype that we've been growing up to be accustomed to. It makes it very exciting, don't you think, to live in an age of discovery of human personality this way.
In the middle of the century, the predominant theory for how to handle intersex was based on research dating back to the 1870s.
Heino Meyer-Balberg is Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia University in New York. In the 1950s, if a baby's sex was ambiguous at birth, the practice was to consider them female if they had ovaries and male if they had testicles.
Money's great achievement at that time was to demonstrate that holding on to these biological indicators as the determinants of sex assignment was plain wrong, because there were too many exceptions that didn't fit the rule. And that was a real revolution when he formulated this new policy that the assignment should be not on the basis of biological indicators, but on a complex assessment of what the most likely optimal outcome given what we knew at that time about biology and social learning and feedback from later outcomes of such syndromes was. In addition, he formulated a lot of revolutionary new concepts such as patient-oriented assignment decisions or reassignment decisions at later stages, which also informed his handling of the transsexual syndromes that came to the fore between 1952 and the 1960s.
In the TV programme that the Reimers saw, Money had brought with him a male-to-female transsexual, as evidence that the sexual equipment a baby's born with doesn't necessarily determine whether it's male or female.
The transsexual certainly made an impact because she was a very feminine-seeming woman. And I thought, here's our answer.
Janet wrote to John Money, and within a few weeks she'd taken Bruce to see him in Baltimore. For Money, the case provided the ideal experiment. Here was a child whom he believed should be brought up as the opposite sex, who even brought his own control group with him, an identical twin. It was perfect. One twin could be brought up as a girl and one as a boy. And if it worked, this would provide irrefutable evidence that nurture could override biology. And Money genuinely believed that Bruce had a better chance of living a happy life as a woman than as a man without a penis.
It is possible, with surgery and hormonal therapy, to habilitate a baby with a grossly defective penis more effectively as a girl than a boy. Under hormonal replacement therapy at the time of puberty, the body develops as female. Vaginoplasty permits a normal sex life, whereas phalloplasty would not. Moreover, vaginoplasty requires only 2 surgical admissions as against as many as a dozen or more for phalloplasty. Orgasmic response is not lost. Motherhood is achieved by adoption. The individual does not feel like a freak.
It made sense at the time that he became a daughter because we thought, well, maybe it can work. Maybe it is a matter of nurture over nature.
So when Bruce was 17 months old, he became Brenda. And 4 months later, on the 3rd of July 1967, the first surgical step was taken, with castration. John Money stressed that if they wanted the sex change to work, the parents must never let Brenda or her twin brother know that she'd been born a boy. From now on, they had a daughter. According to John Money's records,
the mother reported, "I started dressing her not in dresses, but, in little pink slacks and frilly blouses, and letting her hair grow."
The Reimers stayed in touch with John Money, and every year they visited Baltimore.
The mother stated that her daughter, by 4.5 years of age, was much neater than her brother, and, in contrast with him, disliked to be dirty. "One thing that really amazes me," she said, "is that she is so feminine. I've never seen a little girl so neat and tidy as she can be when she wants to be."
Although in contrast, Money also noted,
the girl had many tomboyish traits, such as abundant physical energy, a high level of activity, stubbornness, and being often the dominant one in a girl's group. From the beginning, the girl had been the dominant twin. By the age of 3, her dominance over her brother was, as her mother described it, that of a mother hen. The boy, in turn, took up for his sister if anyone threatened her.
Money continued to record his observations of the twins' development, and in 1975 he published a paper about the case. The children were now 9 years old, and he maintained that the reassignment was a total success.
No one else knows that she is the child whose case they read of in the news media at the time of the accident. Her behavior is so normally that of an active little girl, and so clearly different by contrast from the boyish ways of her twin brother, that it offers nothing to stimulate one's conjectures.
Here was an unambiguous, true-to-life, etc., male that was switched to be a true-to-life female. That made a significant impact on the clinical treatment, and then it was like everybody was saying, "Oh, wow, really, then we can do this."
Milton Diamond is director of the Pacific Center for Sex and Society at the University of Hawaii. Back in the 60s, he questioned Money's proposition that we're gender-neutral at birth and can be reared either way. As a biologist, Diamond thought humans were more than simple products of their upbringing. As a student in the 1950s, he'd been involved in groundbreaking experiments where pregnant rats had been injected with the male hormone testosterone. Their female babies displayed male behaviour, being more aggressive and attempting to mount other females.
So in other words, here's an intervention during their embryonic life which affected their adult life. So those type of experiments showed, at least for animals, that this was possible. My view was a minority view because the Hopkins group had a great status, and my ideas were relatively out of the ordinary.
Perhaps not so much out of the ordinary as out of sync with contemporary trends, whereas Money's approach was much more acceptable at the time, according to Heino Meyer-Balberg.
Biological factors generally, in the aftermath of the Nazi domination of Europe and the misuse of genetics and other biological factors at the time, was in ill repute. So social constructionism was the order of the day.
And would Money have been aware that there were already experiments conducted on rats showing that male antenatal hormones could have this impact on behaviour? Would he have known about those studies?
He was usually extremely well informed, but he had significant doubts that that really had much impact on humans, especially since he had demonstrated already that in spite of gonads, hormones and the like, gender identity could accommodate a wide variety of general behavior variations. Gender identity seemed to be rather uninfluenced by these biological indicators. Animal research didn't help with gender identity because rodents are not assumed to have a representation of gender in their head as humans have.
I have some very fascinating matched pairs of cases. They're matched because they had the same history before they were born, and they had the same diagnosis when they were born. But because they were born with an error or a birth defect of the sex organs, there was a quite natural and legitimate uncertainty as to which way the birth certificate should be signed. Some of the times the decision has been made that the baby should be assigned as a girl, and other times as a boy. I see some of these children after they've been living in their assigned sex for several years, because the local doctor finally discovered that probably the mistake had been made. Now, here's really the main point that I can learn from these children. You can't force them to change their sex when they come into you at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, even if you would have made the other decision had you been there present at the delivery. We all have an extraordinarily convinced degree of our gender identity. And if anybody comes and tells you that a mistake was made and you should change it, you cannot believe them.
Girls with prenatal androgen excess would show some masculinization of the genitalia, often quite dramatic so, and also masculinization of play behavior in childhood, but they still usually clung to the sex they were assigned to, which was female in most cases. So it was by no means very clear that these hormones would have a decisive determining influence of gender identity development. It looked quite that the gender identity development was largely independent.
So one assumes that as Brenda grew older and there were increasingly worrying reports about her behaviour, Money must have believed that she still identified herself as female. Yet the facts that John Colapinto revealed in his book after long conversations with the former Brenda, by now a man known as David, do make that hard to credit.
Working on the book and knowing David was really difficult. I mean, he was a man clearly still in the grip of demons. The rage that he could express was just frightening. It was touch and go doing those interviews. I mean, I really sometimes wondered if it was a good thing to be taking him back into these terrible parts of his past.
I could see that Brenda wasn't happy as a girl. She was very rebellious. She was very masculine, and I could not persuade her to do anything feminine. Brenda had almost no friends growing up. Everybody ridiculed her, called her cave woman.
Well, the kids at school were bullying me because I was different. Kids always bully somebody who's different. It's the law.
She was a very lonely girl.
It got so bad, I wound up having like a breakdown. I'd shake like a baby and cry and huddle in the corner. I didn't know why I was behaving like that.
David speaking to the BBC's Horizon team. By the time she reached puberty, Brenda was feeling suicidal, and when she was 13, the Reimers stopped taking her to Baltimore. Then they decided to do the one thing John Money had warned them against. They told her she'd been born a boy.
I thought to myself, well, I'm not crazy, I'm not turning insane. I thought I was turning insane.
Within weeks, Brenda had chosen to become David. He had reconstructive surgery and eventually he even married. He couldn't have children himself, but he loved being a stepfather to his wife's 3 children. His life as a man appeared to be relatively happy. But what David didn't know until Milton Diamond found him was that he was living on as John Joan in the medical literature.
He had no way of knowing that his case had found its way into a wide array of medical and psychological textbooks that were now sort of establishing the protocols for how to treat hermaphrodites and people who lose their penis. I think it's really what motivated him to talk to Diamond was he just could hardly believe that this was out there as a successful case and that it was affecting others like him.
Cases like John Joan, where he'd had an accident, are very rare. But there are still decisions being made about whether to bring children up as male or female. And these are children with what's now called disorders of sex development. And in the UK, some of those come here to Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. So I've come to see Polly Carmichael, who's a consultant clinical psychologist at Great Ormond Street. You work today with children with all sorts of different disorders of sex development.
Many people think that physical sex is defined clearly in two categories, and either you're a girl or you're a boy. And perhaps also that this is determined before you're born in one step. And in actual fact, there are a series of steps. So there's your sex chromosomes, there's your gonadal status, that is the organs that differentiate into ovaries or testes under the influence of hormones. And then there's also your physical appearance. And so in the course of sexual differentiation before a baby is born, there are a number of ways in which things can go differently. And I guess in terms of the babies we see here, it would usually be a referral because there was some ambiguity in terms of their physical appearance at birth.
How do you think David's case would be treated today?
I think the major differences would probably be that we now have well-functioning multidisciplinary teams around the country, so that the decision would be taken by a variety of professionals. The parents would be much more involved in terms of the decision-making process, and we would, as far as possible, present evidence in terms of the trajectories throughout life for an individual based on particular decisions.
With David, one of the difficulties for him was when he discovered what had been done and the secrecy over it, and that he was devastated by this having been kept from him. Would we see that sort of secrecy these days?
I think secrecy has been incredibly damaging, and over the last 10 to 15 years there have been incredible shifts in the way in which this sort of situation is managed. Obviously, disorders of sex development are incredibly complicated. And so, whilst we've moved towards full disclosure for all individuals, and I think that's absolutely right, there still remain many questions around how and when that should happen.
John Money tends to come out as sort of the bad guy of this story, that he was sort of almost experimenting or wanted to just push forward his own theories. Is that fair, do you think?
I think John Money was a pioneer, and he did considerable amounts for the development of research into issues around sex and sexuality. I think it's unfortunate, really, that descriptions of this particular case have become so polarised. And whilst, many positive things have come out of the debate in terms of how we think about the best way to work with individuals and families, I think what's really tragic is that there was a victim in the middle of it.
In the spring of 2002, David's twin brother died from a drug overdose. David became depressed. He'd lost his job and he was separated from his wife. On the 4th of May 2004, when David was 38 years old, Janet and Ron Reimer had a visit from the police at 10:30 in the evening.
Then they asked us to sit down and they said they had some bad news. That David was dead. And I just cried.
David killed himself in 2004. How did you hear that news?
His father phoned me. I had been in touch with the family in the years after the book had come out. You would hear about the ups and downs.
His brother's died, things aren't going well with his wife. He also lost a huge amount of money as well, all at the same time. So does that mean that we can't know whether he killed himself in the end because of the fact that he was brought up as a girl, or could it have been all the things that happened later?
I think suicide is always multifactorial, and it would be a mistake to say that it was solely because of his childhood or the original botched circumcision. It was so many things, but it was also the fact that depression existed in his family. His mother was a depressive, clinically so, and had been treated for it. So David also had a bad genetic hand dealt to him. If you already had a kind of shaky structure, a lot was heaped on it.
Of course, what we can never know is whether things would have turned out differently if David had been brought up as a boy after the original botched circumcision.
My experience of working with many families with boys who have genitalia that may be smaller or different in some way is that there are considerable concerns on the part of the parents about possible bullying at school. And certainly for young adolescents who feel that their genitalia look different, it's a source of great worry for them. Whichever way you go, there are going to be consequences.
Everyone working in this area must have heard of this case, and of course it did end in tragedy. Is that something that's in people's minds when they're making their decisions today?
I think it has been influential. This case is highly unusual in terms of the normal sexual differentiation antenatally, but a similar group would be the cloacal exstrophy group, who have a really incredibly severe congenital malformation. They have an incredibly small phallus, and in most cases no surgery was required for a female sex of rearing. Whereas in the past, most XY individuals would have been assigned a female sex of rearing. Currently, it would be the exception for that to be the case.
Another issue is the fact that not only did David have a normal male antenatal experience, but his very early upbringing was also that of a boy. Heino Meyer-Balberg.
Manny was called in on the case at age 17 months, and the sex reassignment surgery was postponed until age 22 months. But we know now that by age 18 months, most babies have started to develop a rudimentary sense of themselves and also starting to look for clues for how they should correctly behave as boys or girls. On top of that, he had a twin brother to compare to, and he was the dominant twin by description. So it was particularly difficult probably for him to give up that role of the dominant male twin. So both the age and his particular role in that twinship made it less likely, by hindsight, that he would adjust well to the female gender.
And is it unusual for a case to end up as tragically as David's did? Are there lots of cases where there are more positive outcomes?
In my experience, absolutely. You know, one of the wonderful things about working with children and their families is that children are amazingly resilient and adapt. And with support, I'm constantly amazed at what children are able to take on and manage.
If you've been affected by the issues raised and would like details of information and support, visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4 or call the Action Line on 0800 044 044 in confidence and free from a landline. Mobile operators will charge. Case study is presented by Claudia Hammond and produced by Maria Burgess. Well, we'll join